Smoke from cook fires drifts low over a pine clearing 7 miles outside St. Augustine, and 81 people are walking toward a white flag, trusting a symbol that has meant safety in every war on earth for 1,000 years. 71 warriors, 6 women, 4 black Seminoles who had fought and bled alongside them for 2 years. 81 people walking in unarmed trust towards soldiers who outnumber them, because the flag above that clearing is supposed to mean no one dies today. Within the hour, every single one of them will be prisoners, and not one shot will be fired to make it happen. Sit with that for a second. An army that could not defeat these people in 2 straight years of swamp warfare finally captures their most dangerous leader, not with rifles, not with cannon, but by breaking the single-rule war was still supposed to have. The story you've heard ends with a quiet death in a prison cell, sad but simple, closed. It is not closed. What happened to his body after that death is stranger and darker than the betrayal that captured him, and part of him has been missing, unaccounted for over a century and a half. By the end of this video, you will know exactly whose hands his head passed through, where it was put on display, and why nobody alive can tell you for certain where it ended up. If you want the wars too brutal for the textbooks, this is the channel. Now, back to that clearing, because the man walking into it has already spent 2 years making the United States Army look foolish. His name was Osceola, though he wasn't born with it. He entered the world as Billy Powell, son of a Creek mother, and, most historians believe, a father of Scottish descent. A bloodline that let white Florida society hate him with extra confidence, since to them he was neither a pure enemy nor fully one of their own, just a problem that refused to sort itself into a category. He wasn't a hereditary chief either. He held no bloodline claim to command anyone, which in Seminole society made every warrior who followed him a far more meaningful vote of confidence than a crown would have been. By his early 30s, he wasn't just fighting the United States Army. He was out-organizing it, and everyone from Washington to the Florida frontier knew it. Then, in 1835, Indian agent Wiley Thompson pushed Seminole leaders to sign away their homeland, and Osceola answered him directly. He drove a knife straight through the treaty document, on the table, in front of everyone in the room. Thompson had him thrown in irons for it, a public humiliation Osceola would repay in full. Months later, on the morning of December 28, 1835, Osceola led the party that ambushed and killed Thompson just outside Fort King, catching the agent on a routine walk with an army officer who died alongside him. At nearly the same hour, 25 miles away, roughly 180 Seminole and Black Seminole warriors ambushed Major Francis Dade's column of 110 soldiers marching to reinforce that same fort. By nightfall, 108 of Dade's men lay dead. 3 survived the initial volley. One of those 3 didn't survive the following morning. 2 coordinated strikes the same morning over 100 miles apart, the opening move of a war Washington expected to win in a season. It didn't. 2 years in, Washington's confidence looked like a joke. The United States would eventually pour more than 30,000 soldiers into Florida at a cost that would balloon past $30 million to subdue a Seminole population that never fielded more than a few thousand warriors, hiding their families in swamps the U.S. Army could barely walk through, let alone map. Soldiers marched through waist-deep water for days, ate their own horses when supply lines failed, and watched more of their own die to fever than to any Seminole rifle. Entire companies were declared unfit for duty within weeks of arriving, broken by heat and disease before they ever saw a Seminole warrior in the field. On paper, this war was already decided. In the humid dark of the Everglades, it was a stalemate quietly bleeding the American war effort white. One ambush, one fever, one deserted patrol at a time, and every newspaper in the country knew Osceola was the reason why. By the fall of 1837, that stalemate had one name attached to its failure: Major General Thomas Sidney Jessup. He had already imported bloodhounds from Cuba to hunt Seminole families through the swamp. Dogs bred to track escaped slaves, repurposed to chase a sovereign people through their own homeland. He had ordered forced marches and the burning of entire villages. None of it worked. Osceola was still out there, still organizing resistance, still making Jessup look incompetent in front of Congress. The general who was supposed to end this war in months had spent 2 years being humiliated by a man with no formal military rank at all. So Jessup tried something new. He offered peace talks instead of dogs and torches. Osceola said yes. He was exhausted, weakened by malaria that had gripped him since 1836, and he genuinely hoped the killing might stop. He agreed to meet under a flag of truce near a small outpost called Fort Peyton, just south of St. Augustine. In 1837, that flag was not a casual gesture. It was one of the last fixed laws of warfare that European and American militaries still claimed to respect without exception, a guarantee that as long as it stood, neither side would strike. Osceola sent the request through John Horse, a trusted black Seminole interpreter, asking for a meeting with the officer stationed closest to him. Jessup's written reply granted the meeting. That much was real. Buried inside it, though, was a second order, delivered privately. Agree to the truce publicly. Let the Seminoles walk in believing it. Then arrest every last one of them anyway. The man who received that order wasn't some faceless bureaucrat. General Joseph Hernandez was Florida-born, the son of a Minican immigrant family, and only a few years earlier he had become the first Hispanic delegate ever elected to the United States Congress. He knew this territory intimately, and by most surviving accounts he respected Osceola as a formidable adversary, rather than dismissing him as a savage the way many fellow officers openly did. He carried out Jessup's order anyway, to the letter. The one officer who understood Osceola best was the one sent to betray him. By 9 that morning, on October 21, 1837, Osceola and his 80 followers reached the meeting ground, most still carrying weapons out of habit rather than intent, because the flag overhead told them they had nothing to fear. Hernandez ran through a list of questions. Their answers, by his own account afterward, felt evasive. He sent a runner to Jessup, waiting nearby with troops already in position. The clearing sat quiet for what witnesses later described as a tense, uncertain wait, no one on either side quite sure what would happen next. Jessup's answer came back within minutes. Seize them. It happened almost silently. Soldiers walked forward and encircled the group before most of the Seminoles understood what was unfolding, disarming them one by one under a flag that was, at that exact moment, actively lying to them. No cannon fired. Several warriors reportedly assumed at first they were simply being escorted somewhere for more talks. That's how smoothly it moved. By the time anyone understood otherwise, muskets were already leveled. 81 prisoners, taken by one lie in writing. Not a single shot fired to do it. The reaction was immediate, and it didn't stay contained to Florida. Newspapers ran the story within days, and almost none of them called it a victory. Congressmen denounced Jessup by name on the floor of the House, some calling for a formal inquiry into how a general could order troops to violate a flag his own government had agreed to honor. European papers used it as proof that American claims to civilized warfare collapsed the moment they became inconvenient, and the story kept resurfacing in the international press for months, rather than fading the way most frontier skirmishes did. Jessup spent the rest of his career trying to outrun that single decision. He never fully managed it. Decades later, historians would still be writing about October 21st as the moment his reputation broke. Osceola and the others were marched into Fort Marion, the old Spanish fortress now known as the Castillo de San Marcos. Word of exactly how they'd been taken moved through the imprisoned Seminoles like current through water. On the night of November 30, that anger became a plan. A young war leader named Coacucci. Soldiers called him Wildcat, found a narrow gun slit high in the fort's stone wall, just wide enough for a starved man to squeeze through. He'd delayed the escape for days, hoping Osceola would gain enough strength to go with him. Osceola never did. Malaria had hollowed him out too far to climb. That night, roughly 20 prisoners forced their bodies through that opening one at a time, dropping into darkness on the far side with no idea what waited below, and vanished into the Florida dark, while the man they most wanted to save watched from the floor of his cell, too weak to stand. The Army's answer was to stop trusting Fort Marion at all. On December 31, Osceola and 237 other Seminole captives were loaded onto ships bound for Fort Moultrie, on Sullivan's Island outside Charleston, South Carolina, hundreds of miles between a man who'd spent his life defending one piece of ground and that ground itself. For someone whose entire resistance had been about refusing to leave Florida, that voyage was its own quiet execution, months before the real one. Here's the twist almost nobody expects. The men closest to Osceola's downfall didn't share his fate. Coahuila was recaptured within a year, shipped west instead of held, and lived long enough to lead Seminole and Black Seminole settlers into Mexico in the 1850s, decades after the friend he'd left sick on a cell floor was already gone. John Horse, the interpreter who'd carried Osceola's original request to Hernandez, survived the entire war and led formerly enslaved Black Seminoles on that same migration south, out of reach of both the army and the slave catchers hunting them. Two men on the edges of this story got decades more life. Osceola had less than 4 months left. Most had never seen the ocean before boarding those ships, let alone a northern winter. Fort Moultrie's walls were thick, its air freezing, and Seminole prisoners built for subtropical heat shivered through a Carolina January in clothing meant for a different climate entirely. Some reportedly wrapped themselves in whatever spare army blankets they could get, still shaking through the night. Malaria, dysentery, and the shock of displacement moved through the prisons steadily, a slower, quieter casualty count than any battlefield produced, but a casualty count all the same. Men who had spent their lives navigating swamp and heat now spent their days staring at grey Atlantic water they had never laid eyes on before that winter, hundreds of miles from anyone who spoke their language outside the walls of that fort. Then Charleston did something nobody predicted. Instead of locking away a captured enemy commander, the city's elite treated him as a celebrity. Society women requested audiences. Local newspapers ran updates on his condition like it was a royal illness. The painter George Catlin was granted access to Osceola's cell and produced what would become the single most reproduced portrait of him ever made. Proud, composed, giving no visible hint that his body was failing. That portrait flattered the wrong tense entirely. Underneath the paint, quinsy, a severe throat abscess, was closing off his airway, and years of untreated malaria had left nothing in reserve to fight it. The most famous image of Osceola that exists today was painted days before he could no longer breathe on his own. He held on 3 months. Most people assume a captured war leader in 1838 died forgotten and alone. He didn't. On January 30th, 1838, with his wives and children at his side in a cramped garrison room, Osceola died at 34, regarded even by Americans who supported Indian removal as a man cheated rather than beaten. Here's the part that stings the most. The war he'd spent 2 years bleeding didn't stop with him. It ran 4 more years past his death until 1842, costing an estimated 1,500 American soldiers their lives, most to disease, not combat, and a final bill past $30 million. Roughly 5,000 Seminole men, women and children were forced west to Indian Territory. A few hundred escaped removal entirely by vanishing deeper into the Everglades than any army unit dared follow, and their descendants still live in Florida today. Osceola got 3 months in a cold South Carolina room. His war got 4 more years without him. That should be where this story ends. It is not. This is the part that doesn't appear in the textbooks. Before he died, Osceola asked his physician, Dr. Frederick Weedon, for one thing: send my body home to Florida. Weedon agreed to nothing of the kind. Alone in the room with the corpse, Weedon cut off Osceola's head before the funeral, working quickly enough that most of the mourners waiting outside never realized what had been done until much later. The body, headless, was buried outside Fort Moultrie's walls. The head went home with Weedon instead, sealed in a jar of preserving fluid, riding south on the same roads Osceola himself would never travel again. He didn't even hide it. For years, Weedon displayed Osceola's embalmed head in his family's drugstore in St. Augustine, a curiosity for paying customers who could walk in off the street and ask to see it. And, according to his own descendants' accounts, later used it at home to frighten his children into obedience. A man's severed head on a shop counter as a conversation piece and a discipline tool in the same household. Separately, an officer named Captain Pitcairn Morrison arranged for a plaster death mask, without a shred of consent from Osceola's family or nation, casting the dead man's face in plaster the same week his head was sitting in a jar a few miles away. In 1843, Weedon's son-in-law shipped the head to Dr. Valentine Mott, a celebrated New York surgeon, who placed it in his own surgical and pathological museum alongside specimens gathered for study. It stayed on public display for over 2 decades, one of the most famous native resistance leaders in American history, reduced to a labeled jar on a shelf, visited by curious New Yorkers the way they might visit any other curiosity in the building. Mott wasn't some fringe operator, either. He was a pioneer of American vascular surgery, a name still taught in medical schools today. A war leader who terrified an army of 30,000 men. A shelf exhibit 2 decades later, next to the pickled specimens. Then, in 1866, Mott's museum caught fire. The blaze tore through much of the collection, and by every account historians have been able to find, Osceola's head was never accounted for again. Not one photograph of that head exists. In an era when Osceola's likeness was in constant demand and reproduced everywhere, that single absence fed a different oral tradition entirely, passed down for generations among his own descendants. That Osceola was never sick at all, that he was shot outright, and that the illness was a cover story built to protect the men who'd already broken one sacred truce. Historians who've gone through Weedon's own contemporary letters, describing the throat abscess and the deathbed scene in clinical detail, have found no evidence for a shooting. The record points to quinsy and untreated malaria. An entire people would rather believe their leader was executed than believe he died slowly and had his head stolen afterward. Here finally is the answer to the mystery this video opened with. The popular version of Osceola's story stops at his death, framing it as a tragic but peaceful end. That shortened version survived for well over a century because it was useful to nearly everyone with a stake in it. The government that wanted the flag of truce scandal forgotten, and the institutions that had quietly acquired pieces of a dead man without asking anyone's permission. It let a 19th century surgeon's private museum hold a Seminole War leader's head for 20 years without a single public objection. For more than 100 years, the textbook Osceola was simply a defeated warrior who passed away in custody. Nothing more complicated than that. It took historians like Patricia Wickman cross-referencing Weedon's letters against generations of Seminole oral history and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 to force American institutions to reckon with a century and a half of collected indigenous remains, Osceola's death mask among them, sitting in the Smithsonian's own collection since 1885. 152 years. That's how long it took the full story to catch up to the flag that started it. You've now stood at both ends of Osceola's final year. The clearing outside Fort Peyton, where a white flag lied to 81 people who trusted it, and a New York museum fire that erased the last physical trace of the man himself, without a single photograph left to prove any of it happened. A war leader who forced 30,000 soldiers into a swamp ended his life as smoke and ash in a burning building 600 miles from home. Somewhere between those 2 points sits a piece of American history most monuments still choose not to mention. If you want the rest of the wars too brutal for the textbooks, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.